Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SRHM Podcast, which explores new research and emerging trends in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on using rights-based knowledge for action.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters podcast. I'm Eszter Kismődi, your host today. I'm the Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, SRHM, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this episode where we will explore a fascinating and timely paper that SRHM just most recently published, called The Right to Science in Sexual and Reproductive Health and the Legal Status of the Human Embryo. I have to say I'm very excited about this paper, and I'm very pleased that the authors trusted SRHM to publish with us, both from the perspective to identifying the right to science as a concept as it's connected to as many aspects as possible to sexual and reproductive health, and also specifically talking about the status of the human embryo. The article was published and authored by SRHM and authored by Professor Silke Dyer from University of Cape Town, South Africa, Professor Alison Edelman, Oregon Health Science University, USA, Professor Asha S. George from University of Western Cape, South Africa, Professor Tari Turner from Monash University, Australia, and Professor Joanna and Erdman from Dalhousie University, Canada. And I'm very pleased to welcome today 4 of the 5 authors, Silke, Alison, Joanna, and Asha, who is with us today. Welcome on this show. Together, you bring an exceptional expertise from public health, evidence synthesis, science, human rights, and the law, reflecting a truly multidisciplinary collaboration that also lies at the heart of SRHM's mission. Your article advances a unique approach by placing the right to science, human rights that we don't so often talk about, or more precisely, the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. That is really, in our today world, as your article points out, really deserve a special place in sexual and reproductive health and rights. It explores how scientific evidence, law, and ethics intersects in shaping our understanding of the human embryo, and how grounding these debates in the right to science can promote justice, autonomy, and evidence-based policymaking in relation to SRH. So, on behalf of SRHM, we are very, very pleased about your article. And I would like to start us off and would love to hear in the first round how this collaboration began. And I turn to you, Silke. Can you explain how you came together to write this article? What motivated you, and what unique perspective and angle each of you brings to this conversation?
Thank you, Eszter. Thank you for your interest in our paper. Thank you for arranging the podcast. And thank you for the specific question. So our paper started with a conversation in Geneva at the World Health Organization. And that is because 4 of us, Asha, Alison, Tari, and myself, have been members of an advisory group of the WHO Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health, which also incorporates the special program of research, development, and research training in human reproduction, generally known as the HRP program. So at one of our meetings, annual meetings, we were discussing, as we had discussed many times before, the growing and alarming pushback on sexual and reproductive rights. And we were discussing it alongside a specific event that had really spread like a wildfire through my field, which is infertility and assisted reproductive technology, commonly referred to as IVF. And the specific event related to the ruling of the Supreme Court in a particular country that ruled that human embryos, be it inside or outside of a woman's body, are persons and had the rights related to personhood. And this secular ruling was deeply steeped in religious thinking, religious language, while setting aside the science. And at the time, the ruling opened the door to a particular claim, a claim of wrongful death of minors after 5 embryos, I think it was 5 embryos, had been accidentally lost or destroyed in an IVF laboratory. But beyond that specific incident, the ruling, of course, has major ramification. And at the time, it certainly created a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, concerns, and potential restrictions on the field of IVF and how we effectively and safely practice this fertility intervention. And without going into details here, and then beyond our field of infertility and assisted reproductive technology, it also reverberated through the space of reproductive autonomy, bodily autonomy, and SRHM. And so we discussed in Geneva how to confront such a ruling, and we agreed that it can and should be confronted with science and with the human right to science. Because so much of we know about the embryo, almost everything that we know about the embryo, we know through science and what we have learned from science, and also assisted reproductive technology, which is one of the benefits of science. And what science tells us and developmental biology is that the human embryo, and in the paper we refer to the human embryo as the biological material of human life, that this material is in constant change and flux and can develop along a number of different avenues and trajectories. And it's very important to understand that only a very small proportion of these embryos actually do result in the birth of a baby. So the vast majority of embryos, be it developed inside the woman's body in vivo or in vitro, in laboratories, assisted reproductive technology, do not result in the birth of a baby. And then we also have embryos that can split in two. And if that results in the birth of these 2 embryos, we will have monozygotic twinning. We have embryos that can develop into a tumor, gestational trophoblastic disease. And these are entities or characteristics that we would not expect of persons like you and I. And hence, these examples and this description of the human embryo and our understanding of developmental biology really highlights the incongruency, the non-alignment between what science tells us and a secular ruling that bestows personhood on a human embryos, and in doing so really profoundly impacts reproductive health and rights for everyone under its jurisdiction. We then also recognized that as we got into this work and into writing the paper, that looking at this just through the lens of the human embryo and developmental biology, and this particular ruling was too narrow a lens and too narrow an aperture. So we decided to widen that. We already had a writing team with very diverse expertise. We have Alison, who brought in the angle of safe abortion care, Tari coming from evidence-based guidelines and living guidelines, Asha with her expertise in public health and in the entire field of SRHR, myself from reproductive medicine. So we invited Joanna to join us, who brought in the expertise in human rights and as a human rights activist. And I think that is really how it all came together. I hope I answered your question. And I think that's so much. Back to you and to hand back to my co-authors.
Thank you so much, Silke, for starting us up. It's really fascinating how these various expertise came together on this very important topic. And Alison, I'm turning to you because why, as Silke pointed out, it's the case on IVF and the status of embryo started your discussion and writing this paper. Your expertise also point how restrictions on abortion also affect fertility, IVF services, and other sexual and reproductive health matters, and how it's actually these restrictions are rooted in the same denial of women's reproductive autonomy, persons' reproductive autonomy, and attribution of personhood to embryo. Can you tell us a little bit more how this resonates in your clinical work?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eszter. I mean, I think when we brought together this authorship group, we really wanted to make sure to identify that and to emphasize that pregnancy is a continuum. And at least on the safe abortion side, we've been dealing with the issue of personhood for a really long time. It's just, I think, became quite a kind of civil society conversation when this ruling came for IVF, and everybody was like, wait, what's happening here? And so we really wanted to make sure that we had some attention to the continuum of pregnancy and make sure that we weren't saying something in the right to science and the right to bodily autonomy that would also adversely impact the care that's needed around abortion care, since it is such a common service that is needed for individuals who are wanting to become pregnant, not wanting to be pregnant, using IVF services and then needing abortion for instances that happen because of problems in pregnancy. And so we really wanted to make sure that this article allowed us to talk about pregnancy across the full gamut without restricting in the safe abortion care. And I think for me as an abortion provider, this has been something that we've talked about for a long time, that this personhood idea was going to impact IVF at some time. And so this was not news to us in the abortion world that this would maybe come to impact adversely the full gamut of pregnancy care. But I think it might have been surprising to some folks in the fertility world because they're focused around helping people become pregnant, which most people don't think of as controversial. But again, pregnancy is a continuum. And anytime we start identifying or attacking one piece of it, it impacts not only the ability to get care, but also safe care and also maternal health.
Thank you very much, Alison. So, Joanna, your article is rooted in a human rights approach and specifically on the right to science, that is fascinating. In the first round of questions, I would like to ask you if you could situate the status of the embryo in the international or in the human rights legal world.
Sure. Yeah, great, Eszter. So actually, I think Alison has done a great job of explaining in a very real way the significance of ascribing legal personhood to human embryos. But on a formal basis, I'll just say that the legal intention and the consequence of characterizing embryos as persons is to give the highest order of legal protection to embryos. So this means giving them the same rights as all other persons. And among the most significant of these rights would be the right to life, which is an absolute and inviolable right. And of course, this is why personhood is not just a scientific question. It's because when you give this status to the human embryo in law, it has very real consequences for reproductive care and research, and of course, very real consequences for the lives of people. And so that's why a human rights approach is essential, and one that we take in the article. And so maybe I'll just say that the article had a couple of legal objectives for us. The first legal objective was to explain why an understanding of human embryos as persons just doesn't make much sense scientifically. And this is what Silke has really done in describing the scientific evidence that we put forth in the article. And it's also the reason why human embryos are not treated as persons in international human rights law, that very same scientific evidence. And this is a point for which we cite a critical 2012 decision of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. But I should say it's a point that has just been strengthened in international human rights law because now, and since that judgment, there are new human rights standards that affirm state obligations to ensure the best available science is used in public policy. And so I think, again, this strengthens the idea that an anti-science position or ignoring or misrepresenting scientific knowledge in public policy is itself a human rights violation. Now, the second objective we had for the article was that we acknowledged and very much wanted to emphasize that science has given us a profound understanding of the embryo, as Silke said, the biological material of human life. And so science also supports a legal approach. And here I'm going to quote specifically because this sentence was a really critical sentence for us in the article. And so we said that science also supports a legal approach that recognizes the diverse value of the human embryo as the biological material of human life, both scientifically and socially, reflecting human reproduction as a complex and uncertain process of development and the constant evolution in our understanding of it. And I'll say this was a very difficult sentence to get through editorial review. And the reason why is because people asked, what does it mean? And part of the difficulty of the sentence was that here we weren't simply, I'll say, following international human rights law. Here we wanted to support a new approach or a new paradigm for the field. And the paradigm was this. It's that if we take seriously the idea that science should inform sexual and reproductive health law and policy, and science supports an understanding of the embryo as the material of human life, then why do we accept this kind of balancing frame that happens in human rights law? A balancing frame that always puts the right to life, including in the protection of embryos, against the right of people to make decisions about their bodies and the means to act on them, or the right to pursue scientific knowledge and progress in sexual and reproductive health and rights. The truth is, all of this is life-affirming acts. And so if we really accept, I think that's the idea that's put forward in the scientific evidence and in the article, that human embryos are quite remarkable. They're an awe-inspiring part of human reproduction. And so how can they not figure in our own conceptions of sexual and reproductive health and rights? How can not all of that scientific knowledge, all of that material and stages of reproductive life, not be fundamental to the protection of human rights? And so that's what we wanted to say in the end on the legal approach to the status of a human embryo, is to say, look, the legal protection of all life-affirming sexual and reproductive health care and research, that's, again, as Alison said, it's continuous with, rather than in conflict with, the protection and respect for life in all of its forms. There should never be this tension or conflict in respect for life and reproductive freedom. And if there is a tension or conflict, then we just need to think differently about those two concepts. We're always supporting evolving science and human reproduction, and we're always supporting advances of that knowledge for life, health, and the well-being of all. And that, in the end, is really the legal objective we had for the article.
Thank you, Joanna. So from the legal and human rights, I'm turning to you, Asha, and exploring a little bit the public health and health system perspectives, how these conceptual legal human rights debates land in health system, and why an integrated holistic approach from the public health point of view in relation to SRHR makes sense, especially just following on Joanna's point that we are living in a world of misinformation and disinformation that really affects health and it's causing harm. So how do we land in public health system services from your perspective and from the perspective of the article?
Thank you, Esther. It's such a delight to be reunited with my co-authors. I learned so much in the process. I think we worked together. We had 10 versions, and we each learned from each other because we come from very different disciplines. And it was such a joy. And I'm so delighted that SRHM worked with us on this article. So I'm a professor in health systems, and there are huge ramifications for public health and how we think about health systems with both thinking about the right to science and the taking into account the science around the human embryo. Health systems is the field of how different actors come together to work to support health, rights, and social justice. That's how I define health systems broadly. And that includes how decisions are made, regulations are passed, laws are contested, reformed, and also how science evolves. If we think of science as a process of listening and deliberation, that is an evolving consensus. A health systems perspective looks at all the constituents that have to be listened to. And I think what was really striking is that this is an area there's so much we learned writing the article, but there's so much potential for the future if we support a scientific approach and a human rights approach combined together. There's a lot more in terms of understanding the nuances of women's lives and the decisions they need to make, their aspirations, the nuances of what a woman wants over her life course changes. So we're very fixed and affirmative of human rights principles, but what a woman wants when she's 15 versus when she's 35 versus once 45 might change, but we have to respect where that woman is in her life. And we can do that if we follow human rights principles and we communicate science better. So I'm going to give a very specific example linked to this. What made Silke's intervention made me reflect and think deeply about what is public information about how easy is it to get pregnant and how easy is it to keep that pregnancy, whether in vitro or in the womb. And it made me realize there's still so much shame around miscarriage. But understanding the science of pregnancy and the science of human embryos makes you realize there are many different trajectories once you're pregnant. And we need to understand more, and we need to respect women's rights in that trajectory. It can't be a trajectory defined by other actors that don't listen to what women themselves want and what we know of the science of, as Alison said, the continuum of pregnancy. And it's also a huge humility. So science, there's a lot to learn from science. We can't predict the outcomes, and therefore women might change their minds. We have to respect those decisions, but we don't really know how a pregnancy might turn out. And the same with in vitro fertilization. You might have embryos in a test tube, but that doesn't mean that they will all be carried to term and be human beings later. And I think bringing back that complexity is part of a health systems lens, and communicating what is the science, what are the odds, and doing so in a way that respects women's rights is absolutely critical. And so having that information for women themselves to understand what are the implications, and if they have a negative outcome, that's not necessarily something that it is part of being pregnant or not wanting to be pregnant, that they have certain rights. But I think we are building expectations saying that every embryo will turn into a healthy birth. And that's what the law was trying to do, which I think socially also creates expectations that are really problematic for women. And then on the flip side, on the service delivery side, if you have a law like that, it really makes who would want to be a provider of fertility services. It is a boon to the insurance market. It would lead to a closure of services because you could be held up in court for a criminal offense, because even if you don't have lab errors, certain embryos don't develop further, just like in normal miscarriages. And I think we need more research as to why, and we need to understand the science and the odds. What are the limits to knowledge, and how that knowledge informs our understanding of the phenomena, how that knowledge pushes for further research and understanding, and how we have to be open to listening to science in this area and women's rights. And taking that holistic perspective is really important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, for this wonderful framing of the motivations and perspective behind this article. So let's now take a deeper look at the core theme, what is about the right to science. That is really a very important framing. And Silke, I'm turning back to you to continue explaining the concept of right to science, what it means, how it bridges scientific evidence and human rights, why this framing is so powerful. You started to already explain, and in your article you are quoting the UN and follow your argument on the UN Special Rapporteur on Culture's report and specify how science is defined as testable, falsifiable, and distinct from belief or ideology from a sexual and reproductive health and rights perspective. So Silke, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eszter. I think that is a great question, and I'm really grateful to Joanna and Asha for having provided such a beautiful foundation to this question and for me to elaborate. So the human right to science falls under our economic, social, and cultural human rights. And it bridges, it connects, as we have already said, it connects science with our human rights. It brings them into close proximity. And we have a number of high-level documents from the UN that have provided additional interpretation, guidance on various dimensions on the right to science and the right to the benefits of science, how to protect the right to science, how to promote it, and what a human rights approach to science should look like in our times. And these documents include, as you already mentioned, Eszter, and as we have referred to in our paper, an excellent report from 2024 written by the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And she's written on the right to science and specifically framed it under the right to participate in science. And it's an excellent report, and anyone who's interested to further their understanding on the human right to science, I would really refer them to this report. But I thought it is useful to just highlight three aspects of this report here in the context of our conversation. And I think the first thing is it is useful for us to remind ourselves, what do we actually mean by science? And you've already referred to some of the characteristics, Eszter. And science has been described in these various reports with different wording, but essentially expressing the same thing, which is that science is a human engagement. It's an enterprise done individually or in groups. And the key characteristics include that it's an objective study of observed phenomena. There's a process of validation through the sharing of findings and of data in the peer review process. It involves systematic reflection and results in systems and subsystems of knowledge, which comprise a vast variety of different scientific disciplines. And, for example, by all means incorporates traditional knowledge systems. And very importantly, again, as you already mentioned, Eszter, science is falsifiable and testable. Science is not always right, but it is in the nature of science to revise, to refute, to come up with better understandings. And these characteristics, that it's testable and falsifiable and verifiable, really sets it fundamentally apart from faith and belief. And science is powerful. And I would like to read a brief section from this report, just 2 sentences, because it's just impossible to paraphrase it. But I quote, "Science liberates people, minds, and communities, and offers solutions to major challenges that humanity faces. It enables people to understand the world, dogma to be pushed aside for progress, authority to be questioned, people to communicate, communities to prosper, individuals to attain knowledge, and cultures to evolve." And the third point I want to highlight, and again we refer to this in the paper as well, and referring back to the report, is that the report outlines the difficulties when the science policy interface becomes disrupted and dysfunctional, and how it becomes almost impossible to adopt and implement science-based and science-informed policy, as Asha was also referring to, and while at the same time misinformation and disinformation spreads. So I wanted to highlight these 3 aspects from a very rich report, and I think I'll leave it there and hand back over to Eszter and my co-authors.
Thank you, Silke. So, Joanna, I follow on the third point and invite you to expand on why the right to science or right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and applications matters for law and policy, as Silke pointed out, and how we can use this right in the context of indivisibility of other human rights to shape more accountable and rights-based governance in relation to sexual and reproductive health.
Great. Thanks, Eszter, so much. I mean, I really like the right to science because even in our example, in our specific policy example, it's grounded in the real materialities of human life. And quite frankly, what better basis for political action and aspiration? And so I think there's just a new mandate that the right to science gives in our field. But to think more concretely around the right to science and why it's essential for the realization of sexual and reproductive health and rights, I wanted to return an answer to this question to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and maybe in an unexpected way, to return to advisory opinion that was released just this year. And it was released on state obligations under human rights law to address the climate emergency and human rights, and to put together climate justice and reproductive justice. And the reason to do this is because the court, in this opinion, speaks at length about the right to science, and specifically why this right is essential for sound environmental governance. And so why did I find this opinion so relevant to our conversation today and to the right to science in sexual and reproductive health? Well, first, it's because the opinion is written in the context of a crisis, in this case, climate crisis, but I think we are also facing a moment of crisis, direct, urgent, structural threats to sexual and reproductive health and rights. But the second thing is that the court very much elaborated on what does the right to science mean. In that case, in relation to a healthy environment, but of course, a healthy environment includes the conditions essential for reproductive life. And so in short, I'll say this, that the court really appreciated the value of science as a knowledge system. So it's a way of understanding, perceiving, knowing the world. It's a part of collective intellectual heritage. It's a part of our cultural systems. And most critically, the court emphasized that science is a critical resource for public decision-making on the most fundamental aspects of our lives, and therefore also critical to democracy and the rule of law in ensuring that people can question and consider whether the state is fulfilling its public functions. And here I'll look to Asha in the sense that among its most critical public functions is, of course, public health. And so that's why I just see this opinion as so important for our own field, because from it, I took this idea that without scientific knowledge, there can be no reproductive freedom. And for me, that's why the right to science, whether it be the right in its pursuit, to participate in it, to enjoy its benefit, it's not that it's essential to reproductive and sexual health and rights. It's that it is a right in and of itself of this field, the right to science. And so what does that mean for our work? Well, I think it means we have to reframe a little bit how we think about why and when state action is legitimate in sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I think it's not only whether or not state action causes harm. I think that has been a preoccupation in the field to ask what are its consequences, especially in restricting access to research and services. That's an important part. But we have a more fundamental right in the sense that we have a right to sexual and reproductive law and policy that is built on knowledge. We have a right to policy that is informed by scientific knowledge, because we have a right to know reproductive life as much as we have a right to enjoy our own reproductive life. And so for me, that's what is just so core to the relationship between scientific and reproductive freedom. I think it doesn't mean that we replace political decisions with scientific conclusions, and we made that point very expressly in our article, but it does very much mean that we protect science as a critical resource to sexual and reproductive health and life, And I think that can become a new and urgent advocacy goal for our field.
Thank you, Joanna. I truly enjoyed this conversation and reading your article because it's really bringing us from theory and practice and back and forth. And it's exciting to go back to Alison, that from a societal and clinical impact, how are we connecting the harm that Joanna brought up, that what happens when the right to science is disregarded and undermined, and how this manifests as harm in people everyday sexual and reproductive health experiences. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Eszter. Well, I mean, as Joanna already mentioned, we're at a time where the threat to the right to science and to reproductive health is probably its highest. And we're seeing a key example of that in the dismantling of sexual and reproductive health and science and care actually in the United States right now. And so all of this kind of comes together. So I think we're not seeing a connection in many of the things, and we're seeing kind of a dismantling of actually our bodies that are global bodies that kind of help with this, like the World Health Organization and things like that. So, right now we're having a lot of trouble connecting kind of the science to the healthcare, even though we already know a lot about the importance of sexual and reproductive health. We know that it's like one of the key ways that we can improve health for women and girls and families, and also economic health. It's all linked. We know that restrictions and criminal penalties don't improve health and don't take away the care. And so all of this together, we're seeing kind of a huge societal impact and strife happening around real information. And some of our fault is, not being able to kind of help people connect those all together. And some of that is because we haven't talked about all of the spaces of the continuum of this care. People really want to talk about the good care or the IVF care. And that was highlighted as something kind of bad in this recent legislation in the United States. And so everybody kind of rallied around that. But really, we have to get to the point again of seeing this as a whole life continuum, as Asha was saying, because reproductive health means different things for all of us as we go through life, as a people, both men and women and others. And so it's really important that we're looking at this as a right, and it's a right to care and reproductive health, and then also science. And that all affects our health globally because we're all connected. So I think we're seeing that, unfortunately or fortunately, the US has always had a big imprint on the global kind of awareness of a lot of things, for better or for worse. And because of this kind of dismantling of science and the right to care that we're seeing here, I think we're impacting other places, both in good and bad ways. Like we're seeing other people say, okay, it's our time to stand up. And then we're seeing other people say, oh, maybe we can do this too. So we're just at a time, we're at a very key moment, I think, in history of having all of this together. And it's our job to kind of see if we can bring it back together and to the right of science and how that's important to health and healthcare and our population's health.
Thank you so much, Alison. And Asha, without putting pressure on you of trying to be conclusive, because we see that your article really opened a wonderful space for further discussions and further collaborations. Why do you think that exactly what your article represents, a multidisciplinary collaboration and perspective, is key to ensure both the right to scientific progress, human rights, good governance for health system and service delivery is key to move forward?
So a few points come to mind. Science is so valuable if we think of sexual and reproductive health. Think about where abortion services are, the technology, how that's changed over time. That's because of science. The ways in which you can access safe abortion services has fundamentally transformed. The ways in which women and other people, how pregnancy is a reality for a much broader group of people than before is because of science. There are so many ways in which treatment for breast cancer, diagnosis, and there's still a lot more we have to learn, endometriosis. There's so much more in terms of understanding sexual and reproductive health, and we need to support science to really explore much more. We've come a long way, and we have a long way to go, particularly because science is a system that has so much benefit, but science becomes better when we engage with it as a knowledge system. It has to represent all these complexities that make up sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that is the history of science in sexual and reproductive health. The whole field of contraception, the reason why you don't call it family planning and contraception, has dramatically changed because it engaged with women's health rights activists, and they shaped what kind of technologies was needed. And the same with safe abortion care, IVF, menopause, menstrual health. We never used to talk about menstrual health. So we need to engage with science to support it and push it, to explore these avenues, to realize, in a way, our freedom, our bodily autonomy, our wellness. We have so many more questions to ask, and we can't engage with science as a system if we shut it down with laws that are not based on our understanding of facts. Dialogue is key, but that doesn't mean ignoring scientific evidence. And science has its own way of regulating itself. It's not to say that there have been fundamental transformations, but those transformations have come from dialogue and engagement with science, not from shutting down science. And so I think from a health systems perspective and a public health perspective, this is the time when we need to stand up for science and engage with it, really understand what is the evidence, and understand the evidence more clearly, particularly because of all this misinformation that is now enveloping us, and people are explicitly sowing disinformation. That's why the right to science is even more important today than ever before, because we want to advance it, to open up the frontiers of these many other women's health, sexual and reproductive health issues, the health of trans people. There's so much more that science has answers to, but only if we support and engage with it and understand the evidence better, so that it better represents sexual and reproductive health and rights and social justice.
Thank you so much, Asha, Silke, Alison, Joanna, for this incredibly rich and inspiring, thoughtful discussion, and for your articles, The Right to Science in Sexual and Reproductive Health and the Legal Status of the Human Embryo. The full article is available on the Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters website and the Taylor and Francis website as well. And thank you for the listeners for tuning in. As I mentioned, we feel from SRHM perspective that it's a beginning of, or a continuum of a discussion that we are hoping to expand. The right to science and sexual and reproductive health. Please look for our space in SRHM and all of the partner space, especially around Human Rights Day, when we are planning to use the entry point of this article to broaden it up, the conversation with other thinkers and actors. And thank you so much again, Alison, Silke, Joanna, and Asha, for this wonderful conversation. Goodbye for everyone.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks for joining us for this insightful conversation. Please check the show notes for a link to the SRHM Journal, which is available online and open access. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive notifications for new publications. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a review. Sharing evidence-based and rights-grounded knowledge is our passion, and it's also critical to support the advocacy and actions that need to be taken to improve SRHR for all. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the SRHM Podcast, which is produced by our staff. The music was composed by Tiber Christian and Salomon Beautombe.